Mark Twain's first real hit was a short story known as The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It's also been published as Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog and the Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It's all the same story, certain variations over the course of several months and even years. Twain was tweaking it and revising it, so there are going to be little addition changes depending, but it's all essentially the same story. And in it, you get this very funny portrait of a very Eastern, educated, elevated, cultured, sophisticated, civilized man going into the rough and ready country that Twain made his particular milieu. And this is all very amusing, and it's a really funny little story, and even as you're going through it, you're wondering if, like, the joke is on you. But what is really curious about it, to me, what I find significant in it, is the publication date. The original publication date is in the fall of 1865. What was going on in the nation in 1865? Well, 6 months earlier, we ended the Civil War. And Twain's history with the Civil War is, of course, somewhat murky. He was a soldier, very briefly, on the southern side. He really didn't do much more, by his own account, than go camping for a time, and perhaps certainly never shot a weapon, but his allegiance to that cause was something with which he went on to have a very complicated relationship for the remainder of his career, as his popularity and his particular southernness started to really catch on as a brand. And so this story coming out in 1865, I think, plays an odd role in rehabilitating his image. He needed politically, I think, to change or to cast. He wasn't changing anything, because this was essentially his introduction to the broader reading public, but he needed to create a space for himself where he could exist. And the way that this story goes about that, I find, is really quite intriguing. Anyway, the story is one that is essentially just a drama of voice. There's really not a lot going on in the story, and that's part of the joke. But the differences, the distinctions between dialects, between the dialect of the educated Eastern gentleman and the country bumpkin, if you will, the distinction of those is just fun to go through. And for those of you who have problems getting through Twain's, like, Huckleberry Finn, where you're reading where you're reading all of this backwoods dialect and struggling to make sense of it, is like, hey, is this English? This is an early experiment with that is perhaps a little bit easier to get along, and it helps when you know that, well, it's all essentially a joke. So anyway, the story starts with the Easterner opening up, because it is, after all, the Easterner who would be literate, would be writing, and so he is just introducing this little anecdote for what it is, and then he transcribes, by his own account, the portion that is told to him. The character who tells it to him may not necessarily be literate, so there's some issues there. But anyway, the story is great. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler, and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that, If I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him, as long and tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. Now that's the introductory paragraph, and of course you can just sense the character coming through that. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine, it sounds like a legal document, quite frankly, right there, who wrote me from the East, name-dropping East. I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. It is very legalistic in its tone, very upper crust in its tone, very white shoe in its tone. And that certain doubt that is creeping in already, like, I think he may have been joking with me, but the ego won't allow that admission to come out of that nebulous possibility tone. He cannot admit and come out and say, this guy played a joke on me and I fell for it. That would be beneath the dignity of the man from the East. And so that is the setup right there, and it develops. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of an old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. More pomposity, more swelling up of himself, more preening superiority in this condescension to talk to this bumpkin. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on his own way and never interrupted him once. So that's the setup. And again, more of this preening self-importance and this lurking suspicion that, well, maybe something's going on, and the bald admission that he just doesn't understand humor. He doesn't understand deadpan humor specifically. And so when this guy, when Wheeler leaned in on him and never cracked a smile and never telegraphed that it was a joke, hint, hint, then he had no idea what to do with it. He just went along with it. Oh, okay, well, if you seem very serious about this, so serious on the surface, it must be serious underneath, so I will try and follow along. And he never really admits that that this is all about BS. And then you get this immediate shift in register from all of these long flowing sentences, from all of these fairly ornate and highfalutin SAT words. Then you get this voice interjecting that is bristling with backcountry commonality, commonness, coarseness, fun, quite frankly. And the story that he tells is ridiculous, but the way he tells it is pure infectious joy. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49, or it may have been the spring of 50. I don't recollect exactly somehow, though what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume that wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about, always betting on everything you could ever see. If he could set a body to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Now, curious. First of all, very funny voice. Very funny, goofy, kind of meandering, nonsensical, attenuated logic going on through this. It is just one long stream of consciousness, if you will. A very loaded term to use for this period, but it is a hint of what is coming. But also, curiously, the way it ends right there and on that one sentence, talking about this guy, Jim Smiley, not Leonidas Smiley. He's just off on his own rant. But Jim Smiley, and talking about how much he likes to bet. And he will bet on anything and everything he can. And if he can't find someone to take his action on one particular issue, he will switch sides and bet the other side. 1865, sides don't matter. He just changed sides. Well, what did Twain do essentially by going from being a Confederate soldier to ultimately becoming, after this story, ultimately becoming kind of a New England Don of American letters? He is opening up some flexibility there. He is importing himself into this national culture, saying, okay, it doesn't matter what side, this side, that side, whatever side, let's all just have some fun. Let's all just have a good time. Let's all just sit down and enjoy this story, because sides don't matter, right? You can see what is going on there. And then, of course, the story that follows is ridiculous. It's a jumping frog contest where the frog gets loaded with buckshot, with shotgun pellets, and so it weighs him down. And the frog, notably, is named Daniel Webster, great hero of the East. Another interesting figure that is this is coming in for a little criticism here, but it's a ridiculous story. It is a very homespun story. It is a funny story, and then you read through all that, and it's just this long tirade that is going on, and the reader is perhaps also leaning in, like, what is this? What is going on? And certainly, any curiosity about are we ever going to get to Leonidas W. Smiley in this? That seems to be dispensed with. But if you do find yourself saying, where are we going with this? Then you are in the same position as our narrator here. This poor bastard, he's just sitting there up against the wall, pinned in, cornered by this goofball, this salt of the earth local nut, who is obviously being set up, or who is obviously being used as the mechanism, as a vast joke on the narrator, a joke the narrator is too dense to perceive. So anyway, towards the end, Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and at last he says, I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't nothing the matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow. And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and lifts him up and says, why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds! And turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. Now, this is ridiculous. This is just laughable, laugh out loud, silly, silly stuff. This is not, august this is not important literature of the time. This does not have the swell and dignity of a Longfellow or a John Greenleaf Whittier, or certainly Emerson, or any of the magisterial, august features of the East. And that's the point. Twain is making an argument here that this story, that this character, this Jim Smiley, is more fun than the dignity and the precious authority of the Eastern figures. And Jim Smiley here can be seen as, of course, a stand-in for Mark Twain. Mark Twain, who can tell a great story with lots of colorful characters and ridiculous situations and make you laugh out loud, but is perhaps a little coarse, is perhaps a little goofy, but in the end is smarter than the guys from the East, is more lively, is more entertaining, but ultimately, yes, is more smart than the guys in the East. Because here you can see Wheeler is playing with this guy. Wheeler, there's no concrete evidence, but if you cannot draw that conclusion by yourself based on common human nature and the ability to distinguish human beings and how they act in real life as opposed to literature, then you can make that leap. Because good reading is about judging people and situations on your own, not being told by the authorities how to think about something, but making that creative assumption that, okay, Wheeler is the smarter of these two gentlemen. Wheeler is perhaps a little coarse. Wheeler is perhaps uneducated. Wheeler is just the goofy town nut job who sits off in the corner of the bar. But he is smarter. He has a wisdom. And so he took this hint from obviously, as the narrator suspects, this has all been a setup from his friend back in the East, who perhaps knew that if you got Wheeler going on this story of Smiley, he would just launch off into this absurd, attenuated narrative. But there is the suggestion that maybe Wheeler is in on it too. Wheeler knows what he is known for, and he will comply just to entertain himself, just because there's, some slack time in the back half of the day, let's say, and he just wants to make fun of the guy from the East a little bit, just wants to yank his chain a little bit. And who doesn't? Who doesn't like putting one over on the sophisticate who thinks he is so much better than everybody else? And so this story works on so many levels. It is entertaining. It is subtly reversing certain stereotypes. It is conferring on the reader that sense that, well, do I want to be like the guy from the East, or do I want to be more like the clever guy from the backwoods? And it is at the same time, I think, opening up a place for Mark Twain to operate within the broader culture. He was trying desperately at this point in his life to crack in and be taken seriously as an artist, be taken seriously as a writer. And that was the great struggle of his life. From this until his death, he was always struggling, ironically, to get the respect and dignity of those figures from the East. And so this is a core existential experiment for him, getting this story just right. He revised it so many times, trying to find the right calibration of, I want the story to be entertaining, but I want it to do these other things too. You can see the mechanism getting played with there, and you can enjoy it very much on that level, but you always do come back to the simple fun of the language. dwelling in that homespun talk, that dialect of Wheeler and the backcountry folks, the common, ordinary, contracted, grammatically incorrect, meandering chaos of language that Wheeler possesses and that Twain possesses too. When you just uncork that and let it spew all over the place, it is exquisite.